Hello, so I'm very excited today because I've got a very special guest joining me. Now, it's not usual that I would be excited to speak to a former HMRC policy official and someone that advises businesses on sort of tax and legal matters. But of course, the person that's joining me today is someone very special who probably without their work over the last 20 or so years, and particularly in the last 10 years, many of these bottles in front of me probably wouldn't be here. And the person I'm referring to on the other end of this call is Mr. Alan Powell. Alan, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Richard.
Now, in that introduction there, of course, I mentioned that the work that you've done really has enabled a lot of these bottles that you see in front of me to be produced. Now, that's all around your work going back to the mid-90s. Now, I understand that you were working for HMRC as a policy official, and a lot of the work that you did back then helped liberalise some of the laws around spirit production. Could you take us back to that time, sort of in the mid-90s, and how you came to be working for HMRC and the kind of work that you did around that time?
Yeah, when dragons ruled the earth, yeah. It was the law really I changed in 97 to permit the commissioners to license applicants for distillery licenses where the largest still was less than 18 hectolitres. And that effectively took effect in 97. But we go back a bit actually, because hitherto the commissioners had the powers to issue licenses for distillers on application. They had discretionary powers to refuse that license under certain circumstances. And I'll just go back to some of the circumstances that would have taken place. The commissioners may refuse to grant a distiller's license in respect of premises near a brewer for sale or vinegar maker, in respect of premises where the commissioner are not satisfied that convenient living accommodation can be provided for officers, etc., etc. And in those days, a license was cost £15.75 and was renewed annually. The one thing that was retained, actually, we got rid of all of that. The one thing that was retained was the discretion to refuse a license in respect of which the largest still would be 18, less than 400 gallons, but 18 hectolitres when it was metricated. And that had been the position when I joined the department in 88. And it had been our position that it wouldn't be for commercial purposes, that policy would be varied. It was allowed for Bertie Bulmer at the Cider Museum under the aegis of a charity. It was allowed in one other case, which I can't remember. But it was never varied for commercial purposes. But in 95, the law was changed such that any decision by the commissioners where there was discretion involved and was a negative decision could be appealed to the tribunal. It's called an ancillary matter. And it can be subject to request for review or to go to tribunal and ask for that to be reviewed by the tribunal. And in learning all of this, because none of us knew this stuff we're civil servants, I learned it when I was actually around that branch in terms of implementing the appeal system in effect. And what we learned was, what I learned particularly, was that if the commissioners have discretion, they must be reasonable. One cannot fetter one's discretion. One can have a policy to say, well, we will usually do something and justify it. You can't have an absolute policy. That would be unreasonable. That's called Wednesbury unreasonableness. It's a concept in public law that's very, very important. Having learned that and operating the branch, a unit that implemented this new regime, I came back into the alcohol branch and said, the policy that we have is absolute. It's illegal. What we have to do is have a policy that's reasonable.
Yeah.
And one of my colleagues said, so the commissioners are no longer in charge of their own destiny. And I said, only if we act reasonably. And that's absolutely crucial to understanding so much of the rights of what one has in law, but one wouldn't appreciate without that sort of underlying education in the law. So I said, we can't have this policy to be absolute, no exercise of discretion. So in the internal manual, which comprises how customs will operate before, in this case, I wrote something along the lines of, it's not our normal policy to issue licenses when an applicant has a still less than 18 hectolitres, but if it's a credible application, if it's got a good business case and it's commensurate with revenue risk, it's not going to be too much to fuss, if you like, for the commissioners, then we will consider it reasonable. Okay.
Yeah.
So I published that in what was called the internal guidance X1, X for excise, and X1, first one, again, I wrote that. The first book of guidance was under the new alphanumeric system, X for excise. In the old days, there were all different numbers and things all jumbled up. So in that public notice, in that internal manual, I published that we would have a policy that would be reasonable under in that particular form. I left the department in '97, and I became a consultant commercially with accountancy firms. And I was surprised that nobody ever picked up on that. I was surprised that nobody used that discretionary law to ask for a license and to start producing spirits. The work I did was more in terms of warehousing, imports, exports, oils, all sorts of things. Spirits production was, although it was very interesting, and it had been one of my main areas in the department, was just nothing commercially for a consultant to do. And one picked up on this thing about Loch U, where some very tiny still in Scotland have been licensed, and Charles Kennedy behind it to force this thing through under some sort of old law in Scotland that allowed small stills to be licensed. It's something to do with wash or something, I don't know. And so this guy got his still through at Loch U, and then customs changed the law on it. But customs didn't really seem to like it. And it struck me that, and I found out later, that no one internally customs and excise seemed to realise that the law had been changed to allow applicants to get still below 18 hectolitres. It astonished me. And then we get the Sipsmiths case, where apparently Sipsmiths took 2 years to get a rectifier's licence. Now, that's not a distiller's license, it's a different section of law. And it seemed that I think the commissioners got mixed up over what application was being made and what was required, because there is no restriction anyway. There used to be a restriction where an applicant of a rectifier was near a distillery, but that was repealed in 2006. Okay. So if you ask for a license, commissioners have no powers to refuse it. How on earth it took 2 years, and how on earth commissions could not work out what the law said is, well, it is puzzling, but we are where we are. And
I was just going to say there, sorry to interrupt. So when you did that work back in the 90s and all that sort of policy change that had gone through there, and of course then you'd left the department and you were working as a consultant and as you mentioned there with warehousing and a lot of that kind of thing. So during this period, and I think you mentioned it there, were you just thinking, I wonder why no one has picked up on this and no one's applied for this? Or, I mean, it must have been quite strange, really, because something like that's changed. You change a lot of policy, and no one had taken up on it in that. When did you first become aware? Was it with Sipsmiths? Was it with because I know on their website and in sort of the story, it's kind of makes out that they lobbied Parliament for kind of 2 years to try and get a license. And was it around that kind of time that you yourself started to look back and think, hold on, didn't I change a lot of that stuff back in the 90s? Was it around sort of 2007, 2008 that you started to realise, hold on, something's going on here?
Yes, I think it was Loch U first of all.
Oh yes, yeah.
Before, but Sipsmith certainly was an interesting one because it came on the radar screen around that time. And I just kind of ruefully looked at this news stories that. What's all that about? It didn't make any sense. And when one then encounters applications with customs and excise subsequent to that, you can understand how things were not going the way they should have done.
Yeah.
Subsequent to that, and of course, a lot of it is with the American craft distilling stuff, that people were picking up on that, and people were starting to look to produce spirits themselves in the UK, in England in particular. And I saw these things popping up, and the little stories that went with it, how difficult it was to get a license, how difficult it was to interpret this, that, and the other. Which again is quite, it's quite amusing in its way. But I was on the outside. I wasn't part of that. It wasn't until people started to ask me to get involved as a consultant via the grapevine, via the networks, that I started to get permissions to help people do work on this. And one of the first ones that I did, in fact, the first one I directly got involved was the London Distillery Company.
Yes, I was about to mention that one actually, because I understood that was the certainly when I've did a bit of research into, and actually one of the first people that I interviewed, Darren, who set up the London Distillery Company. He mentioned you straight away. Said you're the guy that you need. Alan Powell is the guy that I need to speak to, because he really did so much at that time for ourselves and for so many distilleries afterwards, that it really kicked it off in terms of whiskey production as well. So how did that meeting come about with Darren? Was that was it? I understand it was in the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. I read somewhere. Is that correct?
That's right. I've been a member of Scotch Malt Whisky Society for donkey's years, and I met Darren at the members' rooms in London, in Farringdon. And then he ran it past me, could they set a distillery up? And I said, well, yeah, is the answer to that yes. Have you got a business plan? Is it credible? Have you got premises that are reasonable? Done it before Knox? All those sorts of things. And yes, there's absolutely no reason, provided that you're credible, provided that you're fit and proper, provided that you meet the basic criteria, the objective criteria. So that's how it got set up. I got involved with it. It has a checkered history, as you know.
Yes,
But in terms of the process, there were a few issues that got held up the process that were really misunderstandings by customers, and there were a lot of problems with them getting them to understand what was required. And some of the problems were down to things that were going on in terms of other issues that were involved with imports by the company from America, from product that had been produced by Darren in America to get it imported. And there'd been errors. There'd been errors all the way through that, not by the company, but partly by Customs and Excise. Anyway, we got the licenses through and we got production going and everything. Thereafter, though, the distillery moved and warehouse that it operated moved from Battersea to Bermondsey, and there were all sorts of problems which I won't go into because it's not really here.
And was that sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Sorry, I was going to say. And so with London Distillery Company, was that your first in terms of, let's say, English whiskey production and a lot of the smaller craft or artisan distilleries, as some call themselves? I guess London Distillery Company was your first kind of one that you worked with, and then I guess it was that when you realised, hold on, there's so many other guys and girls that wanting to go out and do this, but they just don't know where to start. And was it a case that HMRC, for example, was still they were getting applications and it was just like an automatic response? Okay, they've got stills under 1,800 litres rejected, and was it a case that people just didn't know how to appeal at that time?
Well, I think it's not just the distiller's license, and I'll go into that in a minute.
Sure.
It was there was difficulty in customs officers construing their internal manuals. In effect, I don't know why, because it's not too bad. It's quite clear, but the issue isn't just the license. You see, you can apply to be a distiller, and it's a requirement that you have a license, but that's a legal nicety. The real issue is the approval of plant and process and an associated excise warehouse, because once the spirits have been produced, the first account of spirits has been taken in the spirits receiver, the goods must then be removed to warehouse. The law's reverse engineered, that's what happens. So you've got to have an excise warehouse in association with that. Not only that, most people that wanted to do this also wanted to rectify compound gin, which is another operation. It's not related to the distillery operation. It brings you into the excise warehouse. And that's a pretty severe regime. It's not like a brewer or a winemaker or a cider maker. It's a hard regime. And very few people of small scale have been in that regime. It was intended for sort of third-party, large-scale warehouse keepers, bonded warehouse keepers, to use the common parlance. So in association with the distiller's license, there's the approval of the specific planting process. There's the approval of the excise warehouse. You have to be an authorised warehouse keeper. You have to meet a lot of requirements of that regime. So of 2 regimes, in fact, maybe 3 if you're rectifying compound. So it wasn't just the distillery, it's the compendium of application really that needed to be sorted out. And that's where it got tricky for customers to understand that. So, dare I flatter myself that I help them understand that and help them to say how it works. It is in effect what we used to call a drinks factory concept, to allow and overlay a lot of different things within the same premises, legally different, spatially the same, conceptually the same. And on the grapevine, people were hearing that I was working in London Distillery, and it was a collegiate thing because people would come and do some distilling there. So that's where I met Alex Walpert at East London Liquor Company. He was probably the second one. And again, we had to work with the officers, who weren't too bad, but it was a learning process for them. And we got that through. And then there was Silent Pool, which was, again, looked to be making spirits from scratch as well as rectifying gin. And the same officers that were dealing with East London were also dealing with Dan Shaw's Cotswold Distillery. And there's a bit of a delay there. So Dan asked if he could help out there. And yes, I helped Dan get his licenses and applications through and everything. So that was how it happened. It was really by word of mouth. And then I rolled out a lot of distilleries and rectifiers and warehouses. And not just England, but across the UK. In fact, every nation in the UK. And I suppose what then followed from that is the thing began to explode. There were loads and loads of new rectifiers, compounders coming through, many of whom I didn't know. They've subsequently been clients or joined the British Distillers Alliance. At the time, there were loads of new ones. Yeah. And in 2015, I had a meeting with what were called industry experts with customs and excise at policy to talk about the way forward for things. And I said, look, this is a new sector. It needs some help. And I said, look, I'll try and set something up as a trade body, just to coordinate consultations with customs and excise information, promulgate stuff where they didn't belong to trade body. So a few months later, I set up the British Distillers Alliance, really as a flagpole so people could see there's something to come to. And, if you need a bit of advice or there's consultations going on, there's advice there. It wasn't about pink and fluffy. It was about statutory, regulatory, key stuff, foundation stuff. And so that's what happened in 2015, 2016. And really, it's from there on, I don't know, maybe I've done over 100 distillers, rectifiers, compounders.
Amazing, isn't it? Especially when you think that going back to, I mean, of course, my angle for this is all like for the whiskey production, in England, which is amazing, And I think without that work that you've done there to help these small distilleries, I think really, I mean, of course, the English Whisky Company, they were the first in 2006, to set up. And I think knowing a little bit about their history, I think they initially wanted to have a smaller craft distillery, as I understand it. And James Nelstrop wanted just to have just for the local area and to make in his retirement, wanted to make some whiskey for him and his friends in the local area. But that soon, when he read into the 1800 litre stills, and that soon expanded and which is a great thing, because of course now the English Whisky Company are the longest established, and because of their still sizes are a little bit larger, they can keep up with the growing demand at the moment. But it's amazing that it went from one distillery then into we've got around 26, 27 that I'm kind of aware of, and you're probably aware of a lot more that are consulting you at the moment. It's incredible, that growth. And I think really when it seems to be, from the London Distillery Company kind of point, which I was at sort of around 2011, 12-ish, that kind of time. Yeah.
2012.
And 2012. And then I remember reading recently an article, I think it was from Harper's magazine, the sort of trade magazine for the spirit, wine and spirits industry. And it said that there was a headline that said that HMRC was surprised by the amount of applications for distilling licenses, and it went from something like 2 in 2013 to, I think the article was like 30 or 35 or something, which is an incredible growth, really, isn't it? So I guess it from sort of 2011-12, it takes a couple of years for the work that you were doing to then inspire some other distillers who then thought, well, we can do this. It's not as impossible as we first thought when we were looking at it maybe 5 years ago. So it's pretty incredible. So I mean, if there was, if there is someone out there who has got those kind of ideas to start a whiskey distillery, now of course, number one is they should come and consult you. that's one of the most important things. But before they get to that stage, what are the most important things you would say that they would need to get together before they come and chat with someone like you to take it forward?
Well, what do you want to do? Is it a proper commercial enterprise that you really want? There's a significant amount invested in it. Is it something that is more of a labour of love and maybe on a smaller scale? You need to think about what it is you want to do. Because when you go to Customs and Excise, I say Customs and Excise, HMRC, you're going to have to convince them that you're credible. So do your groundwork, do your business plan. How are you going to make money? It's not a game. So really be serious about it. But and Customs, they've got to be reasonable about it too. I mean, it's not just a one-way street. They've got to be reasonable. They can't reject something out of hand or put an onerous conditions onto things, which is a problem I've had to frankly combat with them, going to pick up the customs compliance over things and the industry generally. But the key thing is, do your homework, be ready with your plan to go to customs. The application forms are one thing. The fundamental thing, though, is be serious, credible, thoroughly research your market so that you have a case that is, watertight when you present it. Yeah. One of the things, just segue into the problems areas. One of the things that used to happen is that customs used to say in their public notices, to be a distiller, don't buy any plants, don't rent any, don't lease any buildings, don't buy anything until we've approved you. We won't approve you until you've seen your plants and your buildings. Chicken it. And the same thing applied to excise warehouses as well. We won't approve you till we've seen what you've got, but don't get anything till we've approved you. I mean, that is
it's a bit crazy, isn't it?
It's crazy. So we've worked within that, but I said what I want, and I've met the Deputy Director of Customs and Excise in 2015 about this. A very amicable meeting to say, look, these are some of the problems we've got for new applicants. Can we have, let's call it an approval in principle, that if someone has a business plan and is credible, then can say to Customs, I don't want to buy anything yet, or I've got plans, but before I commit or I borrow money, do you agree that you would approve me, all things being equal, in principle? And that's what they've agreed to do. And we got that handshake in 2015, and that's where that came from. And so now you don't need to have it ready. You can ask for an approval in principle. And the problem is that there is a problem inherent in the application process, because there is a 45 working day service agreement from the time Customs receive your application to the time they must make a decision. So if you went in with a prospect of you've bought something or you're 6 months down the line, your application would be too early, because Customs would have to make the decision within 45 working days. It would fall off the edge. So the timing of it's important. Now, whilst that's a service level agreement, it can go beyond that. But because it's a service level agreement, Customs don't want to go beyond that because it would show up on their figures, presumably. but it exceeded it. It doesn't mean it's an absolute 45 working days, but it does mean that's the period you have to work to. So sometimes it's best to go for an application principle. Sometimes if you know you're going to go forward with it, you've made the investment already, you know the timing of it, put the application in within that 45 working day window. And again, to put that into context, that 45 working days until the service level agreement came in was the movable fees for customers, because they said, oh, it's just guidance. And some of the things were taking 2 or 3 years to come through. So at a joint alcohol tobacco consultative group meeting, I represent the industry meetings with customs policy people. I pointed out that that is not, it's not a guide. If you've published that in a public notice, that's a legal promise, legitimate expectation, legal certainty. It's not guide. It's not. You can't just pretend it's 45 working days. It must be 45 working days. And again, amicable agreement that they would implement it as a 45 working day service level agreement. Like VAT, if you make an application, you register VAT. There's a service level agreement. And the senior deputy director, who I used to work in the old days, said, "Yeah, we'll do it like the VAT, Alan." And again, dare I say it myself, it's something I had to make happen. Yeah. And these are just reasonable things. They're not unreasonable things. They're logical things. And again, come to the reasonable things.
And I think maybe this is the thing so it seems really from that kind of 2015 kind of point that's when we see all this growth in a lot of distilleries, like a real big explosion. We see a trickle kind of from, so 2011, 12, and then 2015, that's when it seems to really explode. And it's, I guess, largely down to that work that you've done to make the application process, the appeals process, all these kind of things that you'd spoken on behalf of distillers and to make these things easier. And I guess there might be some people setting up distilleries now that have, maybe later on they hear about you and the work that you did, but probably have no idea of just because often the people behind the scenes that are doing a lot of the work don't get the credit they deserve, So it's quite amazing that all of that work that you did to smooth, as I was saying earlier, some of these bottles on the table here may not be here without all of that work that you did. And you mentioned there that the British Distillers Alliance, which you set up in 2015. So how many kind of members have you got within that at the moment, roughly? Was it getting
about 200 full members, which are the producers or spirits businesses, and about 70 associate members who are the service providers. Maybe provide. Make stills, make equipment, insurance services, finance, the sort of the ancillary things to the industry. We've got some members that I haven't actually added yet, and some that don't really be visible per se. But it's been, a significant number of people. And I run it for nothing because it's ancillary to a lot of the work that I do anyway. Because I represent the UK Warehousing Association and the Chartered Institute of Tax on Indirect Taxes Subcommittee for that, my professional body. So it's my day job is consultancy, but the spin-offs are I do voluntary work for a number of bodies and interests, and the British Distillers Alliance is of that type. So it's important that people have the access to some information, which is a bit arcane and weird sometimes.
And would you have a rough idea of before you set that up, or let's say 2012, 13, when you were doing the work with the London Distillery Company, would you have an idea of roughly how many kind of distilleries were operating around that kind of time compared to the 200 plus members that you've got now?
Difficult to say, Richard.
Putting you on the spot. I'm very interested to see the growth, the amazing growth over that kind of short period of time.
The people I've never heard. I mean, there are loads and loads of people that are being licensed and approved that I've become aware of, through the press or whatever like that. People mention it. Sometimes they then approach the British Distillers Alliance to join. And sometimes people approach me because they need assistance after they've got started, which isn't a surprise because, as I said, you're entering a tax regime that's really, really severe. difficult. And I say to people when I assist them, look, you're from day one, when you make the application, you've got to know a lot. You're climbing Mount Everest from day one.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to pull you up. I've got the ropes and I'll come and rescue you. But you know, that's what it is really like as a tax return. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And so people come to me, refer to me to help out later on. I just don't know how many people there are out there. I've got about 3 or 4 at the moment that I'm waiting for approvals to come through. I've got more to come through, not necessarily distillers, but warehouse keepers and associated matters like contract packaging for new distillers, for craft distillers in inverted commas. So I've helped set 3 or 4 of those up recently. There's another 2 in the pipeline. There's a lot of stuff going on that's keeping me busy in that way.
Absolutely. I'll have to I'll have to keep emailing you every so often and get the scoop on who's opening up, and so I can kind of stay current on my website. Of course, once those clients make it public. So, but do you think that obviously you're a whiskey fan yourself, and my page is all about whiskey and English whiskey in particular, and you mentioned the Scotch Whisky Society, and so you're obviously a whiskey fan. What are your opinions on the way English whiskey, for example, is going? A question that I've asked to a lot of people I've been interviewing that are either distillers or work within the industry is, of course, in Scotland, there's the regulations as to what makes a Scotch whisky and how it has to be produced before you can label it single malt Scotch whisky, or the same with Irish and the same with bourbon in America. What are your thoughts, and maybe some of your clients' thoughts on the way English whiskey is going? Do we need to have that kind of similar regulation? Because now with Brexit, of course, back in the news again now that the vaccine for coronavirus is out, there's some other news stories that we're starting to see. People have suddenly remembered about Brexit. So it's now those laws as to what governs, what becomes an English whiskey could be blown wide open. So what are your sort of thoughts on that? Do we need a professional body that regulates, I suppose, English whiskey?
Well, it's a good question, and it's certainly one that's been, I'm aware that the English whiskey makers have been looking at. Indeed, regional ones like Yorkshire whiskey makers as well. You mentioned Brexit. In addition to Brexit, the big spirits producers had lobbied the Treasury to look at the alcohol structure in the UK after we leave the EU, because we are currently tied to the, and have been since '93, tied to the Alcohol Structures Directive 92/83 EC, and the 92/84 EC, which is the actual rates applicable to the duties. And we're tied to that, and spirits actually is very discriminated against, inherently in that directive. Spirits discriminated against, and it's been a constant that the industry has perhaps reasonably moaned about the way that the spirits rate is so high, but also that the Treasury is now called for evidence, as it's called, to present to the Treasury Minister about rates and structures, including modernisation as well. That's like part of it as well. It's not just the rates; it's about how the administration and look at it from scratch. So, in the context of leaving the EU, what does the UK want to do? So that's one side of it. That's occupying a lot of my time. In terms of the GI protected, geographical indicated protected measures, which are current under the Spirits Drinks Presentation Regulation, which is an EU-wide thing, that will no longer apply in terms of the UK won't be banned by it. So there's a lot of freedom to choose things, but I think the thing is careful what you ask for. Yes, because like the Scotch whiskies, the Scotch whisky industry have found that they needed to perhaps loosen some of the interpretation of some cask maturation, cask finishing, that sort of thing. But given that there's a blank sheet for English whiskey, and given that there's a blank sheet generally, you could say, well, do we want 3 years minimum, which was an arbitrary figure from 1916 from the mature spirits provisions from World War I and Lord George and all that sort of thing. So spirits could not be released from warehouse unless they've gone 1 day after 3 years, unless they were compounded spirits, which is gin, for example, rectified compound. So it's a kind of accident of history and fate that the 3 years to be warehoused for whiskey was used. Product can be perfectly good after 2 years, say, and you know, and do you want to be bound by the oak casks? You want all of those things, but I think you have to be very careful to start to bind yourself to certain rules, because then you lose flexibility. I don't have a strong view, Rich. I've seen issues where because Customs and Excise used to have the Scotch whisky definition and provisions, and I saw things in the safe that came out of the safe that were very delicate. But what was really going on in the Scotch whisky industry, I'll be going back 30 years, there were certain things and if you bind yourself too tight, you may find yourself in a position that's not in your best interest. That's all I would say about it.
Yeah, I guess it is certainly one that is dividing a lot of opinion at the moment, because you've got certain people that are very much, you know, wanting some experimentation and as you say, not to be completely completely restricted by certain rules and regulations, whereas then others on the other side of the argument are, you know, well, we've got to keep the maturation levels at 3 years, because, you know, suddenly you could get these small have a go kind of distilleries that come along and just want to, you know, release something that they can call whiskey that then, you know, brings down the quality and the impression of English whiskey across the world. So I myself personally, I hope that, and I know there are conversations of having, and it'd be great to see like a get together of all of the English, or as many of the English whiskey producers as possible. In my opinion, perhaps somewhere down like St George's Distillery and the English Whisky Company, and have a bit of a conference, you know, and try and iron a few things out, because I do agree that there needs to be something, you know, some regulations, but I equally agree that you don't want to be bound by too much and stifle creativity, and, you know, where the main goal is to produce excellent quality whiskey that will stand up on shelves next to Scotch and Irish whiskey around the world, you know. So it's a very, very interesting kind of discussion to be had at the moment. And so it's not always nice to hear someone like yourself who's, you know, working with so many distilleries and already worked with so many distilleries, to see kind of what your thoughts are on that. And perhaps I should end our chat with just a personal question. Of course, you're a Scotch fan yourself and a whiskey fan. What are your personal favourite whiskies that you go for?
Well, I have to say something. I'm very lucky to be an old man, you know, and so when I have heard the chimes at midnight, as the barman has it, and that would include some really spectacular malts, you know, in the late 70s, early 80s, that you will never, you know, a Macallan then, or a Highland Park then, or, you know, there was pool of really good whiskey, because it was not a popular drink relative to the white spirits and things. So what I used to like is not necessarily what I like now, and you know, things changed enormously. But if you put me on the spot as to what I would choose, I think Old Pulteney is a really underrated, a really good, a salty. Good all-round malt. I like Islays. You know, I like Bowmore particularly, because that's not too peaty, enough, but not as light as a Bunnahabhain. You know, I like a Speyside. You know, a good. I like Dalmore. I like a Sheridan malt. So, you know, it's really a quick question of, you know, what's the mood?
What you're in the mood for? Yeah.
And what's available these days, you know?
You noticed I didn't ask you the question, you know, what's your favourite English whiskey, because I didn't want to put you on the spot with your clients.
Sorry, they're too new, really, Richard. But what I would say is this: that I tried. Dan Shaw sent me a bottle of his whiskey from the release that's currently out. I think it's excellent. really excellent. I thought it was a lovely, nuanced drink. Fruits, a bit of ginger. I think Dan called it his breakfast drink, malt or something. But it has it is a, for 3 years or whatever it's, it does the job very, very well. And I think it's a very, very good drink. I haven't had the chance to sample many others other than the new makes. They were new makes when I tasted them, so they weren't mature. I am looking forward to trying more of them. And I'm looking forward to some of my clients perhaps giving me some.
Well, I was going to say, I'm sure that you must be a man that, due to all the work that you do and the amount of help, that you've given to distilleries, to open up and smooth the process of their applications, I'm sure that either you must already have or very soon you'll have a lot of these kind of releases flying your way. So maybe the next time I speak to you, you'll have a little cupboard with all these whiskies around and.
It's currently gin, because most people have got gin ready, so the house is full of gin.
Is it full of, oh right.
Gin's okay, but I'm a whiskey.
You're a whiskey, yeah. Me too, and I think there's some interesting things that have been happening, with gin and also whiskey. And one big news story that was Chase Distillery being bought by Diageo, which is quite interesting because now we've got a situation. Well, I know, of course, they obviously didn't buy Chase for the whiskey because they've got other great, huge brands. But Diageo have entered the English whiskey market in a sense, which is very interesting. Do you think there'll be other? Can you see? So I'm adding more questions now. So I was going to wrap it up. But do you think there'll be more of that happening in English whiskey and English distilleries? Some of these big like Diageo and companies like that buying up English distilleries.
Well, Diageo, as you know, have got Distill Ventures as their incubator, and they will invest in smaller, interesting businesses. And I believe that Diageo do have an interest in the growth of smaller businesses. And I understand Diageo will be supportive of a reduced rate of spirits for small spirits producers, which incidentally I'll just segue into, is one of the submissions we've made to the Treasury, that there is a good reason to look at equality of treatment, say the small brewers, notwithstanding the brewers. There's a problem with what they call the cliff edge falling off when you reach the level where you no longer are eligible for the reduced rate as a small brewer. Well, we can take that kind of thing into consideration, but that would be a very good. Dan Shaw at Cotswold is keen on that, and others. That we would look to lobby the Treasury, and I've submitted the paper to the Treasury on that, on the call for evidence for the duty review. And I think Diageo was supportive of that. I think, which is not surprising given their interest in, developing and incubating businesses. I think it's probable that there will be acquisition. The innovation is largely in the smaller, fanatical artisans, sort of thing. But it's not to say I don't like the word craft, because everybody that does the job properly traditionally is a craft. It's kind of second hand, sort of shorthand for artisan, small scale. So I'm careful about using it. But I think that it is the sector that generates interest more than anything, and I think the bigger players will be cognizant of that. Where can they commercially take an opportunity there? So I suspect that is likely to happen. And again, what is it you want to do if you start a business up? Do you want an exit strategy, or do you want to actually keep doing it? Again, it's a question of what's your business plan, what's your strategy.
Yeah. Well, now, Alan, I know you're an extremely busy man, and I'm so thankful for your time chatting with me this afternoon. And I better let you get back to the things that you need to do. So I just want to wrap up and say thank you, again, so much for joining me today. And and thank you for basically I probably wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you about all of these whiskies and some of these distilleries if it wasn't for the work that you'd put in, you know, back in the 90s, and all the work that you've done in the last 10 or so years to support small distilleries and to enable some of these distilleries to get up and running. So thank you so much for that work and for talking to me about it. I think there's many times where people like yourself that are doing so much work in the background, you know, don't get the acknowledgement that they deserve, you know. So it's been a pleasure having a chat with you today.
You're welcome. And don't forget to talk about the hand sanitizers and remitting the duty on that.
Well, actually, yeah. Again, if you've got a moment, that'd be fantastic. Yeah, if you don't mind explaining quickly about that. I don't want to take you from your afternoon sort of duties today, but if you've got 1 minute, that'd be great.
No, set time aside from it. No, the problem was with the COVID situation, beginning of the year, is hand sanitizer. The basis, the solvent is, and also part of the antibacterial side component is ethanol. And we had a lot of members of the British Distillers Alliance and others that were looking to pivot, use that word, pivot, to use the ethanol they held, very high strength spirits, 96%, to go into hand sanitizer made to World Health Organization standards. And the easy solution actually is when the excise warehousing regulations, because the provisions, as I told you, people work in the excise warehousing regime, which is very strict, but it also has a lot of operations that are permitted, including denaturing. And denaturing isn't prescribed. You can add anything to spirits to denature them that remits the duty charge. So you didn't need to be approved to denature spirits. You didn't need to license. You already existed in an excise warehouse regime which permitted you to do that. So a lot of people scream. I'm literally screaming on the phone. Alan, can we use this ethanol and not pay the tax on it? If we pay the tax on it, it'll kill us. But people are screaming for this ethanol, and throughout the country, because the interesting point was, from Land's End to John O'Groats, people are asking for sanitizer, and our people in BDA could provide it, provided the duty charge of £30 a litre was remitted. And I got into customs policy. God, did I have to bang the door down. Remit the duty charge by use of the regulations that exist. It's as simple as that. The warehouse keeper just keeps accounts and records where the product was, when the product was denatured, the volume, quantity. That's the end of it. Solution. Took about 7 days for that to get through, but it worked, and that's why it happened. And the amount of time I put into that, the phones were ringing non-stop at the beginning of March of this year. I was working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, non-stop, and I had COVID as well, coughing. I was absolutely. But look, you know, point about it is the industry wanted to respond. The rules were there that could do the job. All it needed was to identify it and put it in place, and that's how it happened. And you know, it's one of those things where it was just everything was about sanitizer at the time. There's nothing about production of potable spirits. Then, of course, people were selling a lot of product through the off trade rather than the on trade, and people switched back to producing for potable use again, for making gin again. But it's one of those curious quirks of fate that the businesses had stocks of product that could be used for the sanitizer, and you know, local to their area. So it was all's well that ends well-ish.
Yeah, so not only the great work that we've already talked about for distilleries in general, but you also helped in the fight against coronavirus as well. So it's pretty. Oh, fantastic. Well, Alan, thank you again so much for joining me this afternoon. I really do appreciate it. And you know, I'd love to catch up with you again in the future and have another chat, you know, and maybe do something like this again. And so it's been a real pleasure to chat to you this afternoon.
Richard, thank you for your time.